Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us in 2023 to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. If you're a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist training. This Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. And now for our interview. Tina Sachs, PhD, is an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare at the University of California, Berkeley. She studies racial and gender inequities in healthcare settings, social determinants of health and poverty, and inequality. Professor Sachs' work has been published in Race and Social Problems, Health Affairs, and MSNBC News. Professor Sachs also frequently collaborates with the photographer and filmmaker Carlos Javier Ortiz on documentary film projects about issues affecting Black and Latino communities in the U.S. and abroad. Their films have appeared in the Tribeca, AFI, and LA International Film Festivals, among others. Their work has also been published in The New Yorker and The Atlantic. Please enjoy this conversation with Tina Sachs and Brad Kammer.
Welcome, Tina. I'm so happy to have you on Transforming Trauma.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been looking forward to this for a long time, to connect with you and learn more about you and about your work. I was telling you before we started recording, but I want to just share with listeners that I got sent an article that either you had written or you had been interviewed, I think. And there was a line in there that jumped out at me and really hit me very deeply. And I wrote it down. It says, "I have a deep sense of being othered." And I want to ask you professionally how that's impacted in your work and the work that you're doing, but also as much as you're willing to share with us also about your personal impact of that. So maybe we can start by just telling listeners who you are and what you do, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. So I am an associate professor in the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley, and my research is really all about healthcare inequities and how people are treated in the healthcare encounter in the United States. In particular, I also focus on poverty and inequality and a little bit on immigration. I'm really interested in how people's experience of being othered affects their well-being overall, whether that is their healthcare experiences or life expectancy or just their general sort of subjective feeling of well-being. And so my professional work really does emerge out of my own experience as a mixed race person with my mother is African-American from the Deep South. She grew up in the Jim Crow South, had a very incredibly difficult upbringing. And my grandparents were from what is now Belarus, from presumably a shtetl outside of Minsk. And my father was his generation was the first to be born in the United States. And my father's family has a fairly significant trauma history as well, as a group of people who's been hunted all over the world, Jewish people and Black people as well. And so in that respect, I just am that experience of growing up, understanding, sort of implicitly understanding their experience, but never really talking about it per se as about trauma. But then understanding it later as an adult, it became very clear to me that both of them are trauma survivors. And so in many respects, so am I. And that's really sort of how I come to my professional work.
Oh, great. Already so much to dive into. I guess my first curiosity is, do you remember when you were first explicitly introduced to this idea of trauma, that maybe the things that you were experiencing implicitly might have some larger justifications? Or
I think it came to me, to be totally frank with you, only very recently. I certainly had a sense of how unusual my family was for various reasons, where I grew up and how we never fit in any respect in the neighborhood we grew up in. I grew up in Chicago. But it was only recently when I started to think about my mother's experience. She lost her brother in literally a physically traumatic incident. He was hit by a car and passed away when he was 7 and she was 9. And my father's experience moving through the world, he experienced a fair amount of anti-Semitism. I have an aunt who has passed away who suffered from severe mental illness. And so my father was the person who had to maneuver and help her through the mental health system because my grandparents didn't read or write in English. And so all of those things, only recently have I come to understand those as trauma. Like very recently, maybe a couple of years ago.
Was there something a couple of years ago that brought this to your attention?
As I was moving through my own process, I'm a social work professor. I'm not a clinician by training, but I am always in sort of this world of trying to think about how our lived experience affects our mental and physical well-being. And so I had a colleague who was doing some training in trauma work, and she was talking to me about it. And I was like, oh, that might apply to me.
That sounds familiar. Yeah. What sounds familiar to me is that you and I have an interesting kind of parallel, because we both were in our fields that are so much about our own experience, but it took us a while to catch up to that. So I've talked on other podcasts about my own experience of being in the trauma world for a long time now. And it really dawned on me at some point that I was doing this work for myself and to try to stop these intergenerational transmissions of trauma. You did a really cool study, I think it came out last year, about ancestral trauma, where you focused on one particular person. And I'm just curious about some of the work that you've done on ancestral trauma, and what are some of the findings? What are some of the things that you feel like have impact in your research?
Yes. So the study that you're referring to, I believe, is during the course of another study that I was working on, I just by chance encountered a woman whose great-grandfather had been in the Tuskegee syphilis study and who had died as a result of a botched spinal tap that was conducted in the course of that study. And she told me some things that were sort of intuitive, but things that I had never thought about before. One of them was that the loss of her great-grandfather really cascaded her family. It propelled her family into a completely different trajectory than they had otherwise perhaps could have anticipated. So they were then very socioeconomically vulnerable, right? Without the person who was the breadwinner in the family. This is a very long time ago in Alabama. His death left her great-grandmother open to some sexual exploitation, and that led to a whole nother cascade of events. And so it really started to make me think about not only the material loss, like when someone passes away, the material loss that people face, as well as the psychological harm that comes from that. And so people have been, I think we focus a lot on the psychological harm, as we should, but I think it's both that people, when you lose someone or you experience trauma, then you don't have the kinds of material, financial supports or social supports that you might have. And then that leaves you open to all kinds of other potential harms. And so my work specifically focuses on the healthcare encounter. So I'm interested in how people, ethno-racial minorities, experience the healthcare encounter, and how presumably a lot of we walk into the experience, into the doctor's office with the felt sense of loss or harm or trauma, and that the physician or the healthcare provider doesn't know anything about that, right? But that is really what happens to people, and that the past is really present, to quote Michel Foucault, a theorist who thought about these things quite a bit.
Again, I'm curious how you got interested in that specific part of it, the healthcare setting.
I became interested in healthcare generally, also because of my family of origin. So when my my mother, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She had a hard time moving from sort of finding a lump in her breast to actually being diagnosed with breast cancer because she was in a health maintenance organization, an HMO. There were certainly seemed to be some financial incentives to keep her out of going on to specialty care. And so that made me really start to think about what's going on here with the kind of healthcare system that we are engaged in, that we must deal with within the constraints of. And it also made me think about kind of the differences between the way she moved through the world and the way my father moved through the world and the way they were perceived in the world. She is a Black woman. My father is perceived as a white man. And that really led me to I was just deeply curious about how these two people, both of whom I felt there was a similarity in their experience. My mother in many ways was a force from the Deep South to Chicago. And my father's family also were, in many ways, they were refugees. My grandmother survived Stalinist pogroms and then later came to the United States, had many of her extended family were murdered in concentration camps. And so there was something so similar in a way about their origin story, and yet the way they moved through the world was profoundly different because of the way they were perceived in an American context. And that really made me think about these bigger questions of health, of race, of place, of gender, et cetera.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, this is, again, something that I've been working with and thinking a lot about. And it's, the scab has kind of been picked recently because some of these celebrities have been talking about anti-Semitism or practicing anti-Semitism.
Enacting anti-Semitism.
Yeah. And it's, it's difficult because there is such a natural affinity between generally the Black community and the Jewish community in the United States. They've worked together on civil rights, and there's such a shared story in a certain way. And yet there's some serious issues happening.
Extremely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is a complex issue, and obviously I have a lot of feelings about this. I don't have a particularly academic or intellectual perspective on this. And so I just want to say that I don't study this per se, but I think there is this sense that there's a process of racialization that occurs in the United States, in which I remember, just to go back just a little bit, when my grandmother passed away, I found her immigration papers when she came through Ellis Island, and under race, they had her race was listed as Hebrew. And that is an experience, right, that in the United States, people are made into racial groups, made into racial categories, because in the United States, this is really our foundational way of thinking about the world, right? What box do you check? Where do you fit? And I think I have talked to many Jewish people recently who have said, I don't feel like a white person. I feel I have been made into a white person in the United States, but I don't feel like a white person because I feel othered myself. And so I think that's very real. And I also think because of these processes of racialization in the United States, Jewish people have been and benefit from being perceived as white, but only to a point. And so I think that's part of where this unfortunate tension comes from, right? Which is this idea of, as Black people, we are always sort of at the bottom of this hierarchy. And Jewish people may have been our allies at one time, but now they are quote unquote white, or they behave as though they are white, or they have perhaps, to the extent possible, shed their connection with otherness to become more white. And I think that's part of where the origin of this anti-Semitism, at least among Black people, or the force of it, or the very real sense of, it's just so sad to me, because it's like we are allies in so many ways, but this has really come to separate these communities. And I also think this idea of whiteness, and that is also, of course, at the crux of anti-Semitism, right? Which is the idea that Jewish people are not actually white and therefore must be eradicated, right? That's the root of this sort of ethno-nationalism, white supremacist ethno-nationalism, of which anti-Semitism is really a part of, and is very much, these sort of ethno-racists are supremely animated by their anti-Semitism. I mean, this is like their energy.
It's amazing. Yeah. And it seems like that's been going for thousands of years now. You mentioned a little bit how sad you feel. Like, how does it live within you? I mean, in the NARM world here, the podcast, we often talk about the individual impact and how the individual impact, of course, then gets fed back into the more societal impact. But here you are holding both of these identities that are consistently and persistently targeted and objectified and othered. And yeah, I'm just curious about how that lives within you.
I remember once my brother told me, my brother and I have different fathers. So my brother's father was African American, and my brother told me, he asked me a similar question. He said, how does that feel for you to really think about both sides of your ancestry have been hunted to the ends of the earth and tried to almost been exterminated? And how does that feel for you? And I think the way that it lives in me is a sense of survivorship. I feel a profound sense of the people who survived, who have allowed me to survive. These are some really powerful people, powerful spiritually and powerful, presumably physically. And I think a lot about that. I feel a deep sense of humility from both sides of my ancestry, and also a deep sense of agency and power that, wow, like they survived so that I could be here, and what powerful ancestors they are. And that one day when my turn comes, I will hopefully be a powerful ancestor. And that there's something deeply metaphysical and spiritual about this, that I am here. And I also think a lot about, my grandmother, my Bubby, my Jewish grandmother. She was just a no nonsense, powerful, deep person in many ways. And I think a lot about her kind of point of view, the way she survived her life and thrived, not just survived, but thrived.
Was there anything that you can kind of pull from, like, what was the demonstrations of agency with your grandmother?
My grandmother she was kind of a tough cookie. I remember at one point in my life, she told me, Mamala, you will have a hard life. And I was like, why? And she said, because you're very soft. You're very soft-hearted. And this is not a world for soft-hearted people, but it's good that you're soft, but you will have a hard life. And she wasn't wrong, but I also felt deeply seen by her. I felt that she understood who I was. And that was very powerful for me. She had been through a lot in her own life, and she was just like, you got to put one foot in front of the other. A very sort of Jewish stoic kind of way of being. And
yet she saw and celebrated your open-heartedness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
We use this term in NARM a lot, of heartfulness. And, that mindfulness has been such an important thing to bring into Western psychology. And yet it doesn't sometimes live enough in the body, live enough in the heart. And so we have the perspective that childhood trauma is actually kind of the original heartbreak. We learn to disconnect from our hearts because of exactly what your Bubby was telling you. And the work for us is really about how do we reconnect to our hearts and live in a world that is not going to be supportive of that, but not in a way that we have to disconnect, because when we disconnect from our hearts, we can't live the full colors of life. So
that's right. No, I think that's really true. And I think pain and grief is part of life, because in many ways it is love. It's just sort of manifest in a different way. And that's also something that she would tell me all the time. Her favorite tagline was love, share, and forgive.
Wow. That's special. Yeah. Well, it's really nice you had that. You're able not only to have that, but to carry that and bring that forward into your life. So here you are doing this research, this really interesting research on health inequities and ancestral trauma. And what's the intention for you of this? Like, what do you hope the impact of your work has?
In many respects, I hope it's very similar to what you were just saying about getting people to putting out the idea that love is really what matters. I mean, not to be too kumbaya, but that caring for one another is really the bottom line here. And to try to understand that we must care for one another as humans, right? Like we have in the United States, one of the most powerful organizing factors is race. And in spite of that, or perhaps because of that, to deeply connect with each other as human beings is, to me, the most important thing. And all of this stuff, all of these things around race and, religion and all of this stuff, this is all made up. It's not even true. It matters absolutely very much materially in the kind of society that we live in. I'm not discounting that at all. In fact, that's what I fundamentally am trying to dismantle. But I also, on a human level, really want to, the intention of my work is to say, why are we doing this to one another? This is so profoundly harmful, and let's just stop it.
And how has that been received, that message?
I don't know. I think there are limits to that, right? Because certainly if we're talking specifically about the United States, racism and stratification based on race, it serves a purpose. It provides power to certain people. So this is absolutely not an individual level phenomenon, right? There is a reason it continues, because it benefits many people. I am very well aware of that. I think that overall it's received fairly well, and people like you are very generous and ask me to share my experience with them, which I find totally amazing. And I find it to be a huge honor. But how it's received is not that important to me. It's just like it has to be put out there, because I just have to move forward and do the best I can.
Yeah, I love that attitude. I try to remind myself of that too. Yeah. So you have a lot of social work students, obviously, because you're in the School of Social Work. And,
Yes.
and I'm sure some of them go into clinical work.
Absolutely. Most of them do.
What are some things that we might be able to take away from your work or from some of your findings that could help us more on the individual or the family system level?
I think trying to think about people in that family system, and that family system comes from a long line of from our ancestors, so that the person or the family that you see in that office in your clinical setting is really the product of 4 grandparents and 8 grandparents and on and on and on and on and on. And that we really do carry a lot of that, because particularly in the United States, I think we're really oriented to the present. We tend not to think about these historical and intergenerational, both assets and challenges that we enact in our physical being. And so that's one thing I would say, is just to try to be able to hold both of those at the same time. Like, you might have an individual client, but undoubtedly their experience is really informed by many, 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 many previous generations. And so the challenge then of using that intergenerational resiliency, building on that, and then also trying to break these maladaptive ways that we have learned to survive because of our own family systems. And then also, of course, to think about that for many groups of people, Jewish people and Black people, to be more specific, there are ways of being that allowed us to survive. And a lot of that is really good, and some of that doesn't serve us anymore. And so we have to be cognizant of that, and honor that is cultural, spiritual, and there are a lot of things that allowed us to get here that we may need to discard now.
Yeah, we call them strategies in NARM, but yeah, these adaptive survival strategies that we had to develop, that it served a purpose to keep us alive at one point, but now they're actually creating difficulties or symptoms or challenges.
Correct.
It's funny, you went to an area that was my follow-up question. I'm glad, but maybe we can drill down even a little bit more. Like, for people that are listening, let's say white practitioners that have clients that are either Black or Jewish clients. I don't know how many have clients like you that are Black and Jewish, but let's just kind of compartmentalize it for a moment. What would be some specific things for a white practitioner to be sensitive to? First, we can start with maybe Black clients, and then we can talk about Jewish clients.
I think particularly with Black clients, I think honoring the distrust is really important, and not trying to explain it away or not trying to minimize it. Or I think for a lot of ethno-racial minorities, Black people and religious minorities, Jewish people, there is sort of a a national gaslighting that occurs in which it's like, oh, it's not really about race. Oh, that person's not really anti-Semitic. It's not really about that. You're just being oversensitive. That happens all the time. And so when you go to a clinician, you really need to be honored and not gaslit some more. That probably what you're experiencing is real. And I acknowledge that you're experiencing that. And I acknowledge that perhaps I haven't experienced that, but I can believe that you are. That is really, really important to honor that person's perception because that is their lived experience and that's real. So I think that's important across the board because it goes to being able to connect with another human being and honor their perception, their perspective on the world. I think that's really, really important. And I think that's the same for Jewish people as well.
One thing I think about, and I'd be curious on your perspective, is these terms that get thrown out there that often have a lot of charge to them. I like to sit with them and kind of see what the complexity of them. So let's start with white fragility. It's like on some level, what it seems to be is that white people in the United States also have their own, I'm not sure exactly if it fits into trauma, but there's some kind of ancestral legacy that their ancestors have participated in, which for you and me, our ancestors have not participated in those. Although some of the recent anti-Semitic tropes are trying to connect Jews to being slave owners and slave traders. But generally, our ancestors were not part of that subjugation and oppression. I wonder if you have thoughts about that for a white practitioner that really is trying to hold space, trying to be sensitive, trying to understand another person's experience, but maybe is really unconscious about their own legacy. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. I mean, I think it's nothing particularly profound. I think I can imagine that it must feel really bad to be told that you come from a group of people that did some really bad things. And not only do you come from a group of people that did bad things, you are in a group of people that is still doing really bad things. So the harm is both historical and contemporary. And I can imagine that that feels horrible. And I can imagine that we all are complicit in certain ways with a lot of things, a lot of bad things. And that I think just being honest about that and not trying to push it away and minimize the other person's experience, but to say, you know what, I actually am feeling really bad about this right now, or being able to tell yourself that as a clinician. Again, it goes back to understanding your own stuff before you become a therapist and the ongoing work required to do that. I think that's really important, and to understand that it's ongoing. This is not just a historical process, and that in order to be in community with all kinds of people, we have to understand that we are human fundamentally, first and foremost and forever. And we have arranged a society in which some people get the short end of the stick based on race, religion, color, class, gender, sexuality, ability, all of that. So we have to hold that. And for people who are in that majority dominant society, we have to be honest about that. They need to be honest about that so that they can say, you know what, it feels really bad. And I still am responsible for trying to do everything I can to stop it.
This is another complex piece, but sometimes I reflect on another term, performative allyship. But as I deconstruct it, it's hard because I think the intention is coming from the right place. So when a white person is advocating for a person of color or for whatever the person or the group is, although I probably think it mostly has to do with white people advocating for Black rights and stuff. But it seems to actually in some way sometimes flip, where their allyship actually is another form of objectification of the people that they're wanting to serve. Do you have a sense of that as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. Because again, it then takes up all the air in the room. And then the focus becomes the ally as opposed to the issue or the person or the group of people. Or it's very hard for people to hold and tolerate negative emotions.
Yeah.
Across the board. I think Americans really like real surfacey.
Yes.
Everything's great.
Yeah.
And it's forced positivity.
Mm-hmm.
I think people have a hard time sitting with negative emotions. And there are negative emotions that can come from understanding, wow, I live in a society in which I am receiving a lot of unearned benefits.
Yeah.
That feels bad. And it's okay to feel bad about it and then not have to take up the room for everybody else who's living it.
I feel like I'm sharing a lot of my own personal experience here, but I had, again, a very conflicted experience after George Floyd was murdered, because in some way it was so wonderful to see so many people advocating for change. But to the other side, people were acting like just because this was recorded and everyone saw it on Twitter, that this is like, oh my God, now I got to like do something about this. Like, this has been going on for so long. I felt so mixed because part of me wanted to celebrate the advocacy and all the efforts, but part of me felt a little pissed off about it. And like, where have you been? And this is what's been resurfacing for me recently with the anti-Semitism, like on social media after George Floyd. Every person came out and was just Black rights and all the different stuff. And over the last couple of months, there's a lot of stuff happening towards Jews in this country. And I'm not seeing much of anything. In fact, sometimes I'm seeing, like what you said before, it's like you're making too big of a deal about it, or they start to like play with the words around anti-Semitism. And it's like, well, we get to define what anti-Semitism or what racism is. Other people don't get to define that for us. And where have you been? And where are you when we actually really need you? So I feel mixed about it, because I do think we're moving in the right direction. But that performative piece that happened over those couple of months right after George Floyd, I wonder if it would have been different if everyone wasn't locked in their house at that time. If people were doing their daily lives, going to work and social events, like, would have everyone actually advocated in that same way?
I don't think so. All of the factors converged to make that happen, right? Which was I've heard other people say too, that the pandemic on a kind of philosophical level allowed everyone to experience what it's like, the vulnerability to premature death that minorities experience. And that allowed people to be like, oh, this is really bad. And so it created the kind of foundation for people to be able to understand that and then to act upon it. And then certainly the whole idea, people have been saying for centuries that the police are often an occupying and violent force, but now we have phones. And so everyone has a smartphone so they can record it. And so now you see more people now believing that it actually happened when people have been saying it forever. And it's similar to what you're saying. All of these things are related, that anti-Semitism is real. It ebbs and flows, and it pops up and sort of goes a little bit under the radar, and then it always comes. It's always there. And so is anti-Black racism. It is always present. There's always just plenty of work to do.
Yeah. And I think that goes back, there's so much alignment with our model from what you're saying, because so much of what we talk about is, we have this term psychobiological capacity, which isn't a fancy term for resilience, basically, but it's like, how do we develop the capacity to not have to split? Like, we both love this person and are mad at them, or, we trust in this government, but we also distrust. Like, those two things don't have to be at odds. We can actually develop the capacity to be more with the complexity of it. And that complexity is what allows us to feel more human. And the identities and all that stuff that we're using to split, like you said, really takes away our humanity. I love what you said earlier. It's like, none of that stuff is real on a certain level. Like, the only thing that's real is that we're human living beings. And there's a lot of beautiful diversity in how that gets expressed. But we don't have to use that for disconnection. We can actually use it for more connection. I
couldn't agree more. And I think that's why my life's work is really around making any kind of contribution I can to dismantling these forms of discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, all of them, because it actually just makes me really angry. Like, this life is so short. It is but a blip. And to be treating people with such cruelty and stratifying ourselves, it takes away a piece of humanity from us. And we just don't have that long together. And that's why this is really my life's work, because it bothers me so much.
Yeah. And it's living within us and living within you. And I love people that are bringing into their professional life their own personal work. It just feels so powerful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So for folks that want to learn more about you and read all the great work that you put out there, like how can people find you and find your work?
So you can find me at the UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. And if you just Google my name, Tina Sachs at UC Berkeley, it will come up. And then you can find my research and my book and other articles and things that I've written for public outlets like CNN and MSNBC and so forth.
Great. And anything that we can look forward to that you're working on now?
I am hoping to do a follow-up study of the descendants of the Tuskegee syphilis study. It's a very challenging study to try to do because I need to find people who are descendants, and all of the involuntary participants in the study are all deceased and their wives are all deceased. But I'm really interested in that because I want to understand how both trauma and resilience operate and how they affect people who are in that study. So that's something that'll be a couple years down the road.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to that. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to get to know you, and I hope we have another chance to connect at some point. And
thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Take care.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.